The morning air in Greenwich, Connecticut carried the scent of freshly cut grass and old money. Margaret Chun adjusted her simple navy blazer as she walked up the pristine cobblestone driveway of the Whitmore estate, a sprawling colonial mansion that looked like it had been lifted straight from a Ralph Lauren catalog. Her worn leather portfolio felt suddenly inadequate against the backdrop of marble fountains and sculpted hedges that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. She had seen the job posting 3 days ago. Nanny needed for 2 children, ages 7 and 9. Experience required. Competitive salary. The address alone had made her hesitate before applying. Greenwich was where hedge fund managers and Fortune 500 CEOs tucked their families away from the chaos of Manhattan. Just an hour's train ride, but a world apart in every other sense. Margaret was 42, though people often mistook her for younger. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, a certain poise that came from years of navigating spaces where she was underestimated. She had been a nanny for nearly 15 years, ever since leaving behind a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The front door opened before she could ring the bell. A woman in her late 30s appeared, blonde highlights perfectly placed, wearing Lululemon athleisure that probably cost more than Margaret's entire outfit. Her smile was practiced, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Welcome, you must be Margaret. I'm Victoria Whitmore." The woman's gaze swept over Margaret in a single assessing glance, the kind wealthy women had perfected into an art form. "Please come in." The interior was exactly what Margaret expected. Vaulted ceilings, a grand staircase with an ornate iron railing, abstract art that was probably worth 6 figures hanging casually on cream-colored walls. Everything was immaculate, sterile almost, as if the house was more museum than home. Victoria led her through a series of rooms, each more impressive than the last, before finally settling in a bright sunroom overlooking an Olympic-sized pool. 2 children sat at a table doing homework, a girl with dark curls and a younger boy with his mother's blonde hair. They looked up briefly, then returned to their work with the practiced indifference of children accustomed to a revolving door of staff. "My husband will join us shortly." Victoria gestured to a chair. "He likes to be involved in all hiring decisions. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be lovely, thank you." Victoria disappeared, leaving Margaret alone with the children. The girl looked up again, studying Margaret with intelligent brown eyes. "Are you going to be our new nanny?" Margaret smiled. "I hope so. What's your name?" "Emma. And that's my brother, James. We've had 4 nannies this year. They never stay very long." Before Margaret could respond, heavy footsteps echoed through the house. A man entered the sunroom, and Margaret recognized him immediately from the business articles she had read while researching the family. Richard Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Capital Management, a hedge fund that managed over $8 billion in assets. He was tall, probably 6'3", with silver hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. His suit was bespoke, his watch was a Patek Philippe, and everything about him screamed power and privilege. He barely glanced at Margaret as he sat down, scrolling through his phone with the distracted air of someone whose time was far too valuable to waste on mundane tasks like interviewing household staff. Victoria returned with water, handing it to Margaret before taking a seat beside her husband. "So, Margaret," Victoria glanced at a printed resume. "You've been a nanny for 15 years. Most recently with the Patterson family in Stamford. Why did that position end?" "The children went off to boarding school. The family no longer needed full-time help." Richard finally looked up from his phone, his ice-blue eyes fixing on Margaret with the intensity of someone used to evaluating people within seconds and making decisions that affected millions. "What makes you think you're qualified to work for us?" His tone wasn't hostile, just matter-of-fact, as if he were interviewing a junior analyst rather than someone who would care for his children. "This isn't just any nanny position. My children are exceptionally bright. They need someone who can keep up with them intellectually, not just watch television and make sandwiches." Margaret kept her expression neutral. "I have a degree in early childhood development and I speak 3 languages fluently: English, Mandarin, and French. I believe in fostering curiosity and critical thinking in children, not just managing their schedules. I also have experience with children who have advanced academic needs. Richard leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. That's quite impressive. For a nanny, the words hung in the air, loaded with condescension. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Margaret felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, reduced to a stereotype. But she had learned long ago not to react, not to give people like Richard Whitmore the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Richard stood up abruptly, walking toward the window with his hands in his pockets. He looked out at the manicured grounds as if Margaret had already ceased to exist in his mind. Look, I'll be frank with you. We've had plenty of nannies come through here with impressive resumes. They all say the right things in interviews, but what we need is someone who understands their place. Someone who won't overstep boundaries or get ideas above their station. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained calm. I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that, Mr. Whitmore. He turned back to face her, that same patronizing smile fixed on his face. What I mean is, you're here to do a job. You're not family. You're not a friend. You're staff. My children don't need another mother figure trying to insert herself into their lives. They need structure, discipline, and someone who knows when to stay in the background. Victoria stood up quickly. Richard, I don't think that's entirely fair. Margaret comes highly recommended and I'm not finished. Richard's voice cut through his wife's words like a knife. He walked closer to Margaret, looking down at her with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Here's what concerns me. You're clearly educated, articulate, probably came from some middle-class background where everyone told you that you could be anything you wanted. But you ended up as a nanny. That tells me something about your judgment, your ambition, or both. Margaret felt heat rising in her chest, but she kept her hands folded calmly in her lap. Being a nanny is honest work, Mr. Whitmore. I'm good at what I do, and I find it fulfilling. Richard laughed, a sharp bark of amusement that echoed through the sunroom. Fulfilling, right? Look, I need to know that you're not going to quit the moment something better comes along. That you're not going to fill my children's heads with ideas about how everyone's equal and money doesn't matter. Because in the real world, Margaret, money does matter. It matters quite a lot. Emma looked up from her homework, her young face troubled by the tension in the room. James had stopped writing entirely, his pencil frozen. With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore, I teach children values like kindness, curiosity, and respect. I don't think those lessons contradict financial success. Richard walked back to his chair, picking up his phone again as if the conversation had already bored him. Victoria will handle the details if we decide to move forward. The salary is $70,000 a year, which I'm sure seems quite generous to someone in your position. You'll have Sundays off and 2 weeks vacation. Take it or leave it. Margaret stood slowly, gathering her portfolio. She extended her hand to Victoria, who shook it with an apologetic expression that did nothing to mask her complicity in her husband's cruelty. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore. She turned and walked through the pristine house, her footsteps echoing on marble floors. Richard's voice followed her from the sunroom. Victoria, make sure HR runs a thorough background check. People aren't always who they claim to be. Margaret stepped out into the bright Connecticut afternoon, the heavy front door closing behind her with a soft click that felt like punctuation on the most degrading hour of her life. She paused at the top of the stone steps, taking a deep breath to steady herself. 15 years in this profession, and she had encountered her share of difficult employers, but Richard Whitmore was something else entirely. His casual cruelty, his assumption that her worth as a human being was measured solely by her job title, had struck a nerve she thought she had learned to protect. She walked down the driveway, her worn heels clicking against the cobblestones. Behind her, she could hear voices through an open window. Richard's voice carried clearly across the manicured lawn. Can you believe she actually thought she had a chance? These people always do. They see the house, the lifestyle, and they think proximity to wealth means something. She's just a nanny, Victoria. Just a nanny. The words stung more than Margaret wanted to admit. She had spent years rebuilding herself after walking away from everything, and moments like this made her question whether humility had been the right choice or simply another form of hiding. She reached the end of the driveway where her car was parked, intentionally placed far from the main entrance as if even her vehicle might contaminate the Whitmore's pristine aesthetic. But as she approached, she allowed herself a small smile. The afternoon sun glinted off the distinctive Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament, the flying lady that had adorned Rolls-Royce automobiles for over a century. Her car was a Phantom, 8th generation, in midnight sapphire blue with a cream leather interior. It had been custom-ordered 3 years ago from the Beverly Hills showroom, one of the few indulgences she had allowed herself. The car was worth over $500,000, more than most people's homes. Margaret opened the driver's door and slid into the buttery soft leather seat. She started the engine, and the distinctive whisper-quiet purr filled the cabin. As she put the car in gear and began to roll forward, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Richard Whitmore had stepped out onto the front portico, probably to make a phone call or escape his wife's inevitable lecture about his behavior. He was looking down at his phone, not paying attention to anything around him. But then, as Margaret's Rolls-Royce glided past, something made him look up. She watched in the mirror as his expression changed from casual indifference to confusion, then to something that looked almost like shock. His phone dropped slightly in his hand as he stared at the car, at the personalized license plate that read MCHN, at the woman behind the wheel who was supposed to be just a nanny. If you're enjoying this twist and want to see what happens next, take a moment to subscribe. Because what Richard Whitmore doesn't know yet is about to change everything. Margaret pressed the accelerator gently, and the Phantom responded with effortless power, carrying her away from the estate and toward a future that suddenly felt full of possibilities she hadn't considered in years. Margaret drove through Greenwich's tree-lined streets, her mind racing faster than the car beneath her. She had walked away from that world deliberately, chosen simplicity over complexity, anonymity over recognition. But Richard Whitmore's casual dismissal had awakened something she thought she had buried years ago. Not anger exactly, but a reminder that she didn't have to accept being diminished by small men with large egos. Her phone rang through the car's speakers. The caller ID showed Victoria Whitmore. Margaret considered not answering, but curiosity won. She pressed the button on the steering wheel. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore." Victoria's voice was rushed, almost frantic. "Margaret, I apologize for calling so quickly after you left. I need to ask you something, and please forgive me if this seems inappropriate, but what kind of car were you driving?" Margaret smiled slightly. "A Rolls-Royce Phantom. Why do you ask?" There was a long pause on the other end. "My husband saw you leave. He's been on his computer for the past 20 minutes, and I've never seen him look quite so pale." "Margaret, who are you really?" "I told you who I am. I'm a nanny. I have been for 15 years. That part is completely true. But before that..." Margaret slowed the car, pulling into a small park overlooking Long Island Sound. The water stretched out endlessly, gray-blue under the afternoon sky. "Before that, I was Margaret Chen, founder and CEO of Chen Technologies. We developed cloud infrastructure software that eventually sold to Microsoft for $2.3 billion. I walked away with just over $800 million after taxes and distribution to employees and investors." Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone. "You're that Margaret Chin." The Tech Quarterly article about female founders who disappeared after their exits. "You were on that list. I wanted a different life. The tech world is consuming. I barely saw daylight for 10 years while building that company. After the sale, I realized I had money but no purpose, success but no meaning. So I went back to school, got my degree in early childhood development, and became a nanny. I wanted to do something that mattered in a different way." "And you've been doing this for 15 years? Just taking care of other people's children?" "Just taking care of children." Margaret's voice was firm. "There's no just about it, Mrs. Whitmore. It's the most important work I've ever done. Those children I've cared for, I've watched them grow, helped shape who they're becoming. No software program ever looked at me with trust and love the way a child does." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Richard is asking me to call you back. To apologize." To offer you double the salary. Margaret watched a sailboat glide across the Sound, its white sail catching the wind. What do you think, Mrs. Whitmore? Honestly, do your children need someone who will be valued and respected in your home? Or do they need someone your husband can look down on to feel better about himself? The silence on the other end told Margaret everything she needed to know. I think, Victoria finally said, her voice barely a whisper, that my children need someone exactly like you. But I don't think my husband is capable of treating you the way you deserve to be treated. Margaret sat in her car for a long moment after Victoria hung up, watching the sailboat disappear beyond the horizon. She thought about Emma's intelligent eyes, about James's quiet observation, about two children growing up in a house where wealth was everything and human dignity was conditional. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from a number she didn't recognize. This is Emma Whitmore. I took my mom's phone. Please come back. My dad is mean to everyone and I don't want you to think we're all like that. You seem nice and you have pretty hair. Margaret's throat tightened. She stared at the message, at the careful spelling of a 9-year-old girl who was already learning that she needed to apologize for her father's behavior. She typed back, "Thank you, Emma. You're a very kind person. That message alone tells me your mom is raising you right." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Will you be our nanny?" Margaret closed her eyes. This was the moment where she had to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. She had left her old life because it had hardened her, made her calculating and distant. She had become a nanny because children reminded her how to be human again, how to value small moments over big achievements. But she also knew that accepting Richard Whitmore's inevitable offer would mean swallowing her pride, accepting his condescension, teaching Emma and James that people like their father could treat others poorly without consequences. She typed, "I need to think about it. But Emma, remember this. Your worth as a person has nothing to do with your last name or your address. You're valuable because of who you are, not what you have." The response came quickly. "My dad says people who don't have money say that to make themselves feel better." Margaret felt a surge of sadness for these children, growing up with every material advantage but being taught the worst lessons about humanity. "Your dad is wrong," she typed, "and somewhere deep down I think he knows it." Her phone rang again. Richard Whitmore this time. She let it ring twice before answering. "Ms. Chin." His voice had lost all its earlier arrogance. It was careful now, measured. "I owe you an apology. My wife informed me of who you are, your background. I made assumptions that were unfair and frankly embarrassing." "You made assumptions based on my job title," Margaret said quietly. "The only thing that changed between this morning and now is your knowledge of my bank account. I'm the same person I was in your sunroom, Mr. Whitmore. I do the same work. I have the same values. The only difference is now you think I'm worth your respect. I was out of line. You were cruel. And not just to me. You were cruel in front of your children, teaching them that it's acceptable to diminish people based on their profession. That's the kind of lesson that shapes who they become." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "What would it take for you to reconsider? Name your price." Margaret looked out at the water, at the endless expanse of possibility. "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Whitmore. You think everything has a price. Some things don't. Dignity doesn't. Respect doesn't. And I don't work in homes where those things are conditional." She ended the call before he could respond. 3 years later, Margaret stood in the bright, sun-filled classroom of the Chen Academy, a private school she had founded in Stanford. The building was modest compared to institutions like the one Emma and James Whitmore attended, but it had something those marble and mahogany establishments lacked: heart. The academy offered full scholarships to children from working families, children whose parents were nannies, housekeepers, landscapers, restaurant workers. Children who were just as bright and curious as their wealthier counterparts but rarely got the same opportunities. Margaret had invested $12 million of her own money into the project, and it had become her greatest joy. She watched as 23 students, ages 6 to 12, worked on a science project about renewable energy. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their questions insightful. This was what she had been searching for all those years ago when she walked away from the tech world. Purpose that felt genuine, success that was measured in growth and wonder rather than stock prices and acquisition deals. "Miss Chun?" A voice called from the doorway. Margaret turned to see Victoria Whitmore standing there, looking older somehow, more worn. Beside her were Emma and James, now 12 and 10, both taller and carrying themselves with less of the entitled air they'd had 3 years ago. "Victoria, what a surprise." Margaret walked over, genuinely pleased to see them. "Emma, James, you've both grown so much." Emma stepped forward, a carefully prepared speech evident in her earnest expression. "Miss Chun, I wanted to come thank you for what you said to me that day. I've thought about it a lot, about being valuable because of who I am, not what I have." Victoria's eyes were bright with emotion. "We're divorced now. It was finalized 6 months ago. The kids and I moved to a smaller house in Darien. Much smaller. And Emma asked if she could write you a letter, but I thought maybe we should visit instead." Margaret looked at the three of them, seeing something different in their faces. A kind of lightness that hadn't been there before. "My dad still doesn't really get it," James added quietly. "But Mom does now. She says you were right about everything." Victoria nodded. "I spent 2 years in therapy after you left, working through why I let Richard treat people that way, why I participated in it. The divorce was the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most necessary. The kids are happier. I'm happier. We're building a different kind of life." Margaret felt warmth spreading through her chest. "That takes tremendous courage, Victoria." "We were wondering," Emma said, glancing at her mother for support, "if maybe the academy has space for 2 more students? We know it's for scholarship kids and we could pay, but Mom says we should ask if we can earn our spots somehow, volunteer or something." Margaret smiled, looking at these 2 children who were learning, finally, what truly mattered. "We always have space for students who want to learn and grow. Welcome to Chun Academy." Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Through the window, Margaret could see her Rolls-Royce parked in the small lot, a reminder of where she had come from. But inside this classroom, surrounded by curious minds and second chances, she knew exactly where she belonged. The greatest success, she had learned, wasn't in building empires or accumulating wealth. It was in the quiet moments of transformation, in children learning their worth, in parents finding courage, in herself discovering that the best investment she'd ever made was in simply being present, being kind, and being exactly who she was meant to be. No qualifier needed, no justification required. Just Margaret Chin doing work that mattered.